So before we crack this cabinet open and start looking at individual files, there's a very important question we have to answer first. Where in time do we begin? In other words, when did video games actually start having flavor text in the first place? We've already seen that the term was coined to describe the blurbs on Magic the Gathering cards in the early 1990s, but I think it should be fairly obvious that the broader concept dates back farther than that. In fact, if anything, the farther back in time you go, the more games are dependent on descriptive text to even be playable, particularly in the case of computer games. While there were dedicated game consoles like the Atari 2600 with cutting-edge graphics and sound, and by cutting-edge I mean the fact that they had graphics and sound, the most popular computer games for many years were text adventures like Colossal Cave Adventure, Zork, and Starcross. And as the name suggests, these games consisted exclusively of blocks of text and a command prompt for the player. Text was so much more common than proper graphics that some games back then, like the original Rogue in 1980, would literally use ASCII characters as the graphics, with a ticker of text at the bottom providing more detail as to what was supposed to be happening. Although most of the text in these games was there to give the player information about how to solve puzzles and traverse the game world, and some of it was dialogue, you could technically call a lot of this stuff flavor text. It certainly served the same function as flavor text, which is to make the game world more interesting and immersive by briefly distracting the player from the underlying structure of the game's mechanics, as well as creating the impression that there's more to the story and setting than what the player directly participates in. For example, here's the block of text which the player sees upon booting up Zork 1 for the first time. Most of this is functional text. You're told that you're west of the house, so you know that going east will take you toward it. You're told the field is open so that you know you can go in multiple directions from the start. And you're told that the front door is boarded up as a kind of basic puzzle, encouraging you to go around the house in order to get inside. This isn't that different from the original Legend of Zelda starting you off on a map square with a cave, to encourage you to enter it and get the sword. But you don't need to know what color the house is, or even that it is a house rather than some other kind of building. You don't need to know that the mailbox is small either. That doesn't make a difference to how you interact with it. In fact, the mailbox itself is a superfluous element, which only contains a leaflet extolling the wonderful qualities of Zork. This leaflet is more like a bit of comic relief that helps to establish the tone of the game, rather than being related to any puzzles or challenges. Zork is a fantasy game, but not of the somber sword and sorcery kind with wizards and dragons, although Zork 2 is that kind of game, but anyway. Zork is more grounded in reality, which is why it chooses to start you not on a rickety drawbridge leading to a forbidden castle, or surrounded by the cold, slimy walls of a dungeon, but instead out in the fresh air next to an ordinary house with a mailbox out front. However, I don't think it's appropriate to call these descriptive passages flavor text, precisely because they are so common in text adventures, and so thoroughly integrated with the more structural parts of the game. We could just as easily call parts of a book flavor text if the only criterion was the function that the text serves. Because flavor text is supposed to be something associated with games, I think another very important criterion is the fact that these passages of text are an optional experience related to something other than basic gameplay mechanics. In a text adventure, every time you enter a room you get a description of it, which includes both relevant and irrelevant details from a gameplay standpoint. What I choose to call flavor text, and what I think comes closest to the common use of the term, is text that is completely irrelevant to a game structurally. Remember that not all of the text on a Magic card was called flavor text, but just the blurb in italics that appeared at the bottom. Okay, so bearing that in mind, let's move forward a bit to the late 1980s, when the vast majority of games featured both text and graphics. Are there any games from this era that we can say have flavor text? Well, obviously, it would make sense to start with the most dialogue and story-heavy game genre, role-playing games. Let's take the original Final Fantasy as an example. Now, this is a game with a lot of text in it, but pretty much all of it belongs to one of two categories: the kind that appears in the battle screens, which is functional text, and NPC dialogue that you run into throughout the overworld. Well, so what, you may be thinking. Just because something is dialogue doesn't mean it can't be flavor text, especially if it isn't plot-related and helps establish the tone of the game, right? And I would say that this is mostly correct. Character dialogue can be flavor text, and some very popular flavor text in certain games technically falls into this category. The Piclopedia from Pikmin 2 comes to mind. But that doesn't mean that all NPC dialogue, or even all of it that isn't plot-related, actually is flavor text. So, putting the dialogue from Final Fantasy under the microscope, one thing that you see right away is that a lot of it really is plot-related, even though it's optional. Lots of NPCs will tell you where to find special items, or ask you to complete a major story-related task. And then when you find the item or complete the task, they'll basically say, "Oh wow, it was really cool of you to do that." Now, maybe my standards are a tad high, but to me that doesn't seem to be doing much to flesh out the setting. It's just adding a little fanfare to things you were going to do anyway, like the little tune that plays whenever you win a battle. There's also quite a bit of dialogue that exists to give more character to, well, characters, rather than the setting or the world's history. People will say nasty things about the bad guys, or express their own personality, or comment on the player character. Is this flavor text? Kind of, but not in the same way that the blurbs on Magic cards are, and not in the same way as the things I'll be discussing in this series. We could sit and debate all day about whether characters should technically be considered part of the setting of a story, or whether they should exist on their own as a separate aspect of the plot. But I have a more objective objection to NPC dialogue that's character-focused being considered flavor text. The voice. And I mean that word the way your high school English teacher used it. You know, like first person, second person, and so on. You see, NPC dialogue is always told from a first-person voice, the voice of the character who's talking to you. Whether or not the writer does a good job of establishing their unique character and sounding the way such a character should sound, from the perspective of the story, it's that character talking, not the author. Narration, on the other hand, can be either first-person or third-person. Technically, second-person is also a possibility, but let's not overcomplicate this. And regardless of which one it is, this kind of text is the author speaking directly to the reader, which gives it a very different feel. Dialogue is a way of establishing relationships between characters and is focused on their subjective viewpoints and emotions, whereas narration is the author telling the audience what is happening, meaning that it's at least ostensibly the objective truth. Narrators can be mistaken, or even deliberately lying, but while you're reading narration, it's expected that you'll believe what's being said. In the case of an unreliable narrator, this usually leads to a twist, but a twist only works if you did believe what you were told to begin with. Any story that routinely explained details through narration and then invalidated the explanation later on would be deeply frustrating to the reader. Imagine a detective novel in which the detective describes the furniture in a room, only to say 5 pages later that the description was incorrect and the actual furniture in the room was different. It would be fooling the reader for no reason, and with details that aren't important enough to be worth lying about. So generally speaking, authors don't monkey around with narration too much unless they have a very specific storytelling goal in mind while doing so. And I would argue that flavor text, as it's commonly understood, is always a kind of narration, not dialogue. It involves describing things, and these descriptions should be considered true from the standpoint of the game's story, whether or not they're realistic or even believable. In fact, taking ridiculous ideas seriously is one of the basic building blocks of comedy. If the flavor text is being delivered by a character within the story, usually the main character is chosen for this, then it should either be accurate, or, if not, the mistakes in it should be related to that character's unique outlook. To bring up the Piclopedia again, Olimar says several things there that are debatable, but that's because he projects his own thoughts and experiences onto what he sees. On the other hand, if an unseen third-person narrator is the one delivering the flavor text, like in Golden Sun, for example, then it should just be true, full stop. Whew. So, all of this is a very long-winded way of saying that yes, there is flavor text in the original Final Fantasy. There's just not much of it, and most of the game's text is something else, even when it conveys a lot of personality. I should hope that this is pretty obvious when you look at most games. Final Fantasy VII, for instance, has a world and characters with a lot of charm and uniqueness to them, but most of that doesn't come from flavor text. It comes from, the story. In terms of adding something to a game, flavor text is a spice, not an ingredient. It helps to differentiate games with similar stories, but it's not a basic component of the story. It's something that's added later, when the dish itself is already cooking nicely and just needs a little extra kick to make it memorable. The fact that a game has an intricate story is no guarantee that it will also have an abundance of flavor text. In my experience, flavor text is usually a reflection of the game designer's interest in making a detailed world, not necessarily a detailed story, and these priorities can easily conflict with each other. For example, if we compare two RPGs like Earthbound and Chrono Trigger, which came out around the same time and both had a lot of effort put into their writing, you can see this dilemma in action. Chrono Trigger has more backstory underpinning its plot than most games, but it still pays much more attention to the plot. You don't get the impression that the world is interesting on its own, so much as the events that characters get swept up in as the story unfolds. The story of Earthbound, on the other hand, isn't that complicated in its broad strokes. What makes the writing exceptional is how much attention was paid to optional interactions and side details. Eagle Land feels like a place where wacky things happen all the time, of which the events of the story are just a small part. Not unimportant, mind you, just small. Because of this, the authorial voice itself in Earthbound has a lot more to say, both through flavor text and more directly through metatextual asides. The 2 coffee breaks are a good example of this. While not all of this stuff is strictly optional, I do think it comes closer to my idea of flavor text than character dialogue does, regardless of the quality of writing. But there are other RPGs from a bit later on that come even closer. The first game that I can remember playing that had a prominent flavor text encyclopedia was the original Pokémon in 1998 with its Pokédex, which was much more strongly associated with the series than its in-game usefulness would justify. This is probably at least partly because the associated anime featured it so much. But I also think it's just a natural extension of the game's central hook. This was a game about catching and training various creatures, and sprites and statistics can only do so much to make these bits of data feel unique. You can tell at a glance that Pikachu is a mouse, that Ponyta is a pony, and that Clefairy is some kind of cutesy teddy bear thing. But if you consult the Pokédex, you'll learn that Pikachu can gather together and cause thunderstorms, and that Ponyta's hooves are 10 times harder than diamond, and that Clefairy's cute appeal has many admirers. There's absolutely no need to read any of this, but it enriches the world and makes it more fun to interact with. And unlike the previous examples, this is a totally separate part of the menu that you have to choose to boot up, not just something that crops up from time to time while you're playing the game normally. Features like this, to me, are the quintessence of what flavor text is and why it's put into video games. The closer we get to the present, the more likely a game is to have this kind of thing. By the mid-2000s, Nintendo had become a little obsessed with this idea and used it all over the place. The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker had a bunch of collectible figurines with little blurbs describing what they were based on. Super Smash Bros. Had a mountain of trophies, each with its own, sometimes quite extensively researched, flavor text. Metroid Prime had its data logs. The original Pikmin had Olimar's Journal, and Pikmin 2 had the Piclopedia. The only major series left out of this was, unsurprisingly, Nintendo's icon of game design purity, Mario, although even it flirted with the concept occasionally. These were the games that originally gave me a taste for the unique flavor of flavor text, but before long I started running into it in other places too. Enemy lists in the Castlevania series and Hollow Knight, item descriptions in Baten Kaitos and Demon's Souls, the Clan Primer from Final Fantasy XII, the Super Luigi stories in Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, and pretty much anything anyone says in Mystical Ninja for the N64, among others. So to return to our original question, when did flavor text really start to become a thing in video games? Unfortunately, I don't think I can give an exact answer. It was obviously starting to emerge in the late 1980s, when video games began to have large enough settings and complex enough mechanical inputs to allow for the reading of optional text as a kind of bonus for interested players. By the mid-1990s, some games had started to experiment with including large amounts of in-game lore that came from the game itself rather than from the characters, and by the late 1990s, this was an established feature in a few RPG series. By the mid-2000s, it was common in several other game genres as well, and by the late 2000s, just before Dark Souls came out, it was so common that people kind of started to take it for granted. So I'm going to make a somewhat arbitrary choice here, and start the timeline for this series in the year 1996. This was a pivotal year for gaming, seeing the worldwide introduction of the N64, as well as the first big wave of classic PlayStation games. It also marks a time when advances in graphics technology were slowing down a bit, and developers started emphasizing polish and special features in the promotion of their games, with a sharper focus on setting details and unlockable content, both of which are related to the prominence of flavor text. Please note that just because I'm starting at this point doesn't necessarily mean I have specific examples in mind for the year 1996. It just means that I won't be discussing games from before this year. Also, the games I'll be talking about won't appear in strict chronological order, but rather in the order that I experienced them growing up, and I didn't play some of these games until a decade or more after they first released. One more thing. Before we begin the series proper, let's recap the criteria that I'll be using to decide what is and isn't flavor text when it comes to video games. 1. Flavor text is in-game text that describes places, people, items, historical events, and so on, with a level of detail that isn't strictly necessary for either the coherence of the game's story or to help the player overcome gameplay challenges. 2. Flavor text is optional, so if a piece of dialogue or exposition is more about fleshing out the setting than advancing the story, but it occurs during a game-critical cutscene, it is not flavor text. 3. Flavor text can, and often does, exist outside the context of the game's story, in a form that can be seen by the player but not by the characters, or in some metaphysical place like the developer rooms in some Japanese RPGs. 4. Despite this, flavor text does not have to be visible only to the player and can exist in the form of dialogue. For example, the things your partner says when you use the tattle move in the first 2 Paper Mario games count as flavor text, even though a character is speaking them. 5. Also, even though flavor text is often accessible to the player at any time, this isn't a necessary trait. Flavor text can be temporary and missable. Again, in the first Paper Mario, Goombario's tattle dialogues don't get saved anywhere for the player to read again later, but they still count as flavor text because of their storytelling function and optionality. 6. Finally, flavor text almost always consists of factual statements about things, in contrast to dialogue, which is often more emotional. In the case of encyclopedia-like flavor text, the facts being talked about are usually true. But when a character is the vector for flavor text, it can be false, usually to set up a joke or to reflect the personality of the character who's speaking. Alright then, I think that's enough preamble for now. Next time, we're going to take out one of these files, flip it open, and take a long, deep whiff of flavor. I'll see you then.